Number 1. Let Jesus save you. Number 2. Come out of your blanket, cut your hair, and dress like a white man. Number 3. Have a Christian family with one wife for life. Number 4. Live in a house like your white brother. Work hard and wash often. Number 5. Learn the value of a hard-earned dollar. Do not waste your money on giveaways. Be punctual. Number 6. Believe that property and wealth are signs of divine approval. Number 7. Keep away from saloons and strong spirits. Number 8. Speak the language of your white brothers. Send your children to school to do likewise. Number 9. Go to church, and regularly. Number 10. Do not go to Indian dances or to the medicine man. These were the rules that Indigenous children had to follow at boarding schools. Native American boarding schools' method of assimilating Indigenous children was achieved, as they were completely deprived of communication with their native families, traditions, and were coerced into having new connections with white people. It all started with the Manifest Destiny, the goal of expansion for white settlers. The Indigenous people stood in the way of that American dream. Carlisle Indian School was the very first Native American boarding school, and the school that went down in infamy for its cultural assimilation. It was founded by Captain Richard Henry Pratt. This is the story of the loss of communication, the sting of rejection, and the physical and mental trauma faced by the children who attended the various Native American boarding schools across the country, and the impact on future generations of Indigenous people. The boarding schools were modeled after Fort Marion, where Native prisoners were held and, in Captain Richard Henry Pratt's words, civilized. Pratt thought that if these prisoners of war could be civilized, so could Indigenous children, as they were in the way of the Manifest Destiny. The captain founded the very first boarding school, Carlisle Indian School, in 1879 in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They thought that if they whitewashed the children or assimilated them, then the Indigenous culture would stop being passed down by generations. So, they forced them to learn English and live life like an average white settler. As a result of attending these schools, there was severe mental and physical abuse, resulting in heavy psychological damage for the children. A form of emotional abuse was the school administrators telling the children that their culture was worthless, that it was not real. This was extremely damaging to the children because the culture they grew up with was suddenly being condemned by complete strangers. Another example of the mental damage was attachment injuries. According to Fern Naomi Renville, a Native American storyteller, theater artist, and educator,
when a child who is safely bonded, safely attached to their parent or caregiver is with that parent, their body is literally producing all of the happy chemicals that our body makes. Dopamine. When we were taken away from our parents, regardless of how much our parent might have loved us, how safely bonded we were to them before that, when we're taken away from our parents, when we're separated from them, it is an injury to the psyche of a small child. And it creates a lifelong emotional response that plays out literally in your body chemically. So a child who's not safely attached, who has that kind of attachment injury, when that child is with their parent, their body is producing anxiety chemicals.
Another main issue was PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, from the years of mistreatment at the hands of the schools. This in turn led to future issues such as addiction, drug abuse, alcoholism, and even suicide. This led to damage in future generations. At the actual schools, the children were subject to many forms of culture shock. With the change of lifestyle from native to white, they felt really out of place at the schools. Some native parents saw that going to the boarding schools was an opportunity that their children couldn't miss because they couldn't afford to take care of them and wanted them to be cared for. They were forced to give up the languages they spoke originally, and they were punished horribly if they were caught speaking in a language other than English. In a lot of tribes, hair is an important sign of strength. Jem Labarda, a cultural interpreter at the NMAI, says this.
Our power, our strength, our knowledge is in our hair. So when you have long hair, you have lots of wisdom, you have lots of power, you have lots of knowledge. When they went to these boarding schools, their hair was cut. And so the missionaries, they knew the power of what they were doing to these children.
Communication with families was very limited, and children almost never got to go home over the summer.
And those boarding schools were so far removed from their families that sometimes the families didn't know where their kids were exactly. So for them to return home, I think it really varied.
Most children who attended stayed at the schools for years at a time. If they were lucky enough to be able to leave the schools, they usually went to stay with white families to learn how to be more white. After the children left the boarding schools for good, some of them had the hardship of dealing with rejection, both from their white peers and their own families. They were lost between two worlds. According to Dr. Debbie Reese, in white society, that sort of rejection is not specific just to Native people. White folks have done that forever, to anybody who they deemed other. Their own Native families, they were referred to as apples.
Red on the outside, white on the inside. Where you look Native, but you act white because you've been assimilated.
In summary, acceptance of the children from boarding schools and Indigenous people in general was rare. No matter what they looked or behaved like, they were without a society to turn to. As generations move forward, less and less people are aware of their once familiar Indigenous culture. Parents and grandparents never passed their culture on to their children because of their experiences at the boarding schools. Ancient and important languages are being lost. Families and tribes from all over the country are still recovering from the trauma inflicted upon their older people.
And this left actual trauma in boarding school survivors' DNA, which is then passed on to their children and their children.
Years go by and there have been dramatic changes. The relationship with the white society has gotten better, and so has the relationship with the Indigenous tribes. Communication with the tribes are no longer limited, and the trauma that they experienced is healing. However, it may never heal fully. Also, remember that the children who went to these schools are survivors, not victims. Professor K. Sayanina Lomawaima says this.
Thinking about our terms is really, really important. So we're not going to say victims. We're going to say survivors and non-survivors, perhaps. And that's really important because this notion of Native victimhood is deeply, deeply, deeply entrenched in U.S. society and mythology of U.S. history. It kind of naturalizes the fact that, oh, Native people lost. Isn't that too bad? They're such victims. We can feel bad about it.
Native American boarding schools everywhere helped to get rid of the culture of the Indigenous people, leaving lasting impressions with the sting of rejection, loss of communication, and the physical and mental damage. Native American boarding schools forced Native children to have new relationships with whites, and because of the stripping method the schools used, they were robbed of their culture and communication with their tribes. Sadly, this sort of thing happens even today. Immigrant children are being ripped from their families and detained in detention centers, with their families usually having no idea where they are. Number 1. Wreck traditional communication between Native Americans and replace it with the American way. Number 2. Choose a violent approach to the situation, one that will leave scars. Number 3. Implement psychological abuse into daily routines of the children at the boarding schools. Number 4. Assimilate the students at the school so that they are strangers to their own culture. Number 5. Leave trauma coursing through the veins of generations of Indigenous people. These are the effects of the boarding schools and what they have done to the Indigenous people of the nation. Just as taking away kids back then was justified, taking away kids is being justified now.